We will proceed now to our next presenter. I believe Conrad Janzen is queued up. Conrad is a visitor safety specialist with Parks Canada. He's an ACMG mountain guide, and I've had the pleasure of poaching one of his up tracks a few times at Ferry Meadows, and he's going to talk to us about the Mount de Poilius avalanche in April 2019. Conrad, welcome. You are all queued up, and if you hit presentation mode, you're ready to roll. There you go. Thanks.
All right, the audio is working.
You're coming through great.
Okay, good. So yeah, I'd like to share a case study for an avalanche that Parks Canada responded to last year, April 20th, 2019, and it occurred on Mount de Poilius in Yoho National Park. And overall, the response went fairly smoothly, but it was we thought it'd be worth sharing because it had sort of a remarkable companion rescue situation that can provide an example of what a group might have to deal with when multiple hazards exist and things go wrong. It highlights some of the complex decision-making involved in an organized rescue response to an avalanche in high glaciated terrain, and perhaps provides a couple things to consider going forward. I won't be discussing the decision-making of the party to enter that terrain. I think that would be better done talking to them. And unfortunately, despite everyone's efforts, at the end of the day, the one critically buried patient passed away in Calgary. The avalanche happened on Mount de Poilius, and Mount de Poilius is located on the western side of the Wapta ice fields. It's often accessed from the Guy Hut, and that's what this group had done today. They skied down onto the de Poilius Glacier, crossed that, and then started working their way up the North Glacier. Generally benign terrain down here until you reach a head wall that gives you access to the summit ridge. The avalanche hazard during that time had just spiked. We had 60 to 100 centimeters of HN in the previous 48 hours with strong southwest winds. Wind and storm slabs were likely up to size 3 in our InfoX submissions. And internally, we were calling the hazard 444 in the morning, and with the drop in natural activity 433 in the afternoon. So pretty touchy out there, and especially for kind of an unusual situation for being the end of April. In our public avalanche bulletin, we had already switched to spring conditions, so there were no hazard ratings being displayed. We did have strong travel advice in the headline that said avoiding avalanche terrain would be wise. And wind slabs up to size 3 were the first problem in the list of problems down below. We're actually unsure if groups at the huts in this area had access to this information because all of them would have been on multi-day trips and would have left sort of 2 to 3 days previous to this avalanche occurrence. What we do know is that there were a number of groups having close calls in the area. This is a picture of the President Glacier, and you can see, if you look really closely, some ski tracks coming down here that got covered after they went by an avalanche off the side of the mountain. And this is the uptrack from some other groups that left the Guy Hut that morning and started working their way over towards the Stanley Mitchell Hut, going up through isolated call, and they either skier triggered or skier remoted a very healthy size 2.5 off to the side of the ascent route here. The group that I'll be talking about, like I said, was working their way up the North Glacier on Mount de Poilius, following roughly this blue line. And they had just reached the head wall up here. which is the steepest portion of the climb, and like I said, gives access to that summit ridge. They were roped up, traveling uphill, and they triggered a skier accidental size 2.5 from about 2/3 of the way up the slope. This 2.5 remotely triggered a skier's, or sympathetically triggered a size 3 that ran all the way down onto the main Des Peloux Glacier. And the party was pushed about 70 meters from their approximate trigger point down to the burial location. And the avalanche they triggered was about 60 centimeters deep on average and just over 200 meters wide. So fairly large. When everything came to rest, the front person was critically buried about 1.5 to 1.7 meters deep. The middle person was caught underneath the rope and buried up to his neck with one hand out of the snow. And then the bottom person was suspended in the crevasse with the debris going over their head. They were faced with a pretty difficult self-rescue and companion rescue situation, and I think they actually handled it pretty well given the circumstances. The middle person was able to get themselves out. They did have difficulty getting out from under the rope and considered cutting it because they had no idea that the other person was dangling in the crevasse. Then they had to pick a direction, so they went up, dug out the front person, got to the point where his face and chest were exposed, gave him a couple of breaths, and then triaged the situation when there was no response and started moving back down towards the bottom of the rope. As he was approaching or kind of following the rope towards the crevasse, he heard some muffled cries and assumed that his friend was shallowly buried, and then shortly after determined that his friend was actually in the hole itself. The person in the crevasse had been hanging on the rope, which kept kind of slowly sinking down, secured themselves to an ice screw, ditched their skis, put on crampons, took out an ice axe, and using the ice axe and the prusik was slowly climbing out of the vertical crevasse wall when he made voice contact with the second person. And at this point, about 20-25 minutes had passed at least, but again, that's an estimate based on their best guess. Once the middle person made contact, he helped quickly pull the guy out of the crevasse, and then they rushed uphill, started CPR, continued digging out the critically buried person, eventually moved them down onto a better platform and had some insulation underneath them and got them covered up while continuing CPR, and triggered both spot devices that they had with them at the time to call for outside help. And they continued the CPR until we got there, although we didn't have any information about all those aspects of the situation. Overall, on the companion rescue or self-rescue side, I think, like I said, they did pretty well. They were well equipped for the trip. They were able to get out of the crevasse, get themselves out of the snow, and get their third person out of the snow. The middle person was able to do some triage, first determining that the initial person he dug out was unresponsive, going back to help the second, and then focusing their resources on the first again. And they were able to call for outside help, which is pretty key, and then continue to perform first aid. We received the call, and we were in kind of a unique situation at the time. Our rescue team was divided into both a response team and a recovery team. And the recovery team was dealing with a pretty high profile recovery of 3 climbers who'd gone missing in an avalanche on Howes Peak on April 16th. So they were out there with a helicopter and dog team and all the recovery gear, but not the normal first aid response gear that we might take to an avalanche like this. They were, however, significantly closer to this than the rest of the team. So as a result, after we got the call, we got them to start heading over in this direction while we brought the rest of the gear from the rescue rooms. And they arrived on the scene about 25 minutes sooner than the team from Banff and Lake Louise. By arriving first, they were in charge of assessing the scene, accessing the scene, and carrying out the initial patient care without all the tools that we might normally have in hand. And they also arrived with very little information. All we had was the coordinates from 2 spot calls, but the fact that we had 2 spot calls definitely showed that there's something urgent going on. Some of the factors in their decision making once they arrived on scene, they were switching from recovery mode, where they had time to think and plan, to rescue mode, where time was of the essence. Like I said, limited equipment and no information about the call prior to arriving. Urgent situation with CPR in progress and no idea on burial times or when arrest might have occurred. And managing multiple hazards like hang fire, crevasses nearby, flying at an altitude of 3,000 meters, suboptimal winds and light for flying. And then because we now knew that this was a CPR in progress type of call, we were getting lots of requests for patient information and scene information from the various responding agencies, STARS, EMS, dispatch, things like that. So the first team on scene had to make a lot of decisions in a hurry. What they did was they decided to, what they did overall was they decided to lighten the helicopter by dropping off 1 rescuer and extra gear at the guy hut. Then they dropped a second rescuer at a flat staging area, kind of off to the side and out of some of the overhead hazard. And then they were light enough to go in with just 2 rescuers and tow in next to the location where CPR was being performed, access the patient, and then quickly load them internally and transport them back to EMS while performing CPR in the back of the 407. The second helicopter and the second team arrived shortly after this and dealt with picking up all the people. You can see some of the uninjured people moving towards staging here, and bringing them all back to the guy hut and then flying them all out with all their gear. Some of the things that helped with the kind of critical decision making during those few moments when that first team arrived were asking for radio silence from all the other agencies and dispatch, just to give themselves a chance to think and make a good plan and kind of manage all the hazards that were happening at that scene. One of the ways they did this as well was asking everybody on board to just remain quiet and do a couple of flybys over top of the scene, and then move away and make a plan where everybody could put their thoughts into the pot and pick the best thing. And that seemed to work quite well. Some of the other things that helped were having a dedicated response team for the initial call and to back up the first team that arrived. We haven't always done this when we've been involved with long-term recoveries, and I think we've learned from the past, and it seemed to be really useful to have that dedicated team that could do all the background information and get organized. And then having 2 helicopters made a big difference as well. That first helicopter could leave immediately with the critical patient and not worry too much about leaving rescuers and the rest of the ski touring party sitting at 3,000 meters in kind of suboptimal weather on the mountain. There wasn't as much of a risk of them getting stuck up there or not being able to get them out in a timely fashion. So what kind of stuff did we learn from this, or things to consider going forward? One of them is whenever we fly out for a rescue or recovery, we have to balance how much gear we take for the task at hand. For more remote responses, we, as a result of things like this, we definitely consider taking a little bit more first aid gear to the site in case we get tasked with a second response and end up first on scene like this group did. It's always a balance point between how much you want to fly with and how much you want to prepare for something that's kind of low likelihood. But I think as a team, we kind of decided that it would be helpful to have a little bit more. Another thing that it's highlighted was switching between spring conditions and hazard ratings. Sometimes it's difficult describing all the nuances of spring conditions when winter-like storms are present in the Alpine, and especially after a really big storm dumping a lot of snow like we had. We do have the ability to switch from spring conditions to regular winter hazard ratings, but some of the questions are, does one impact people more than the other? If we did make that switch, would people pay more attention to it? And how do we then describe all the spring conditions that are still occurring on lower elevations and south-facing terrain during that time? And the other part is clear, strong advice in the headline, like was done that day, as beneficial as the colored rating. So just a couple of questions to think about for us, especially because we do have that ability to switch back and forth. And like I said, I'm not totally sure if the groups out touring in that area on that day would have had access to those conditions anyways, but it's certainly thoughtful for us, or thought-provoking. And then finally, one of the tools that we've picked up since this incident occurred is something called the Zoll Autopulse. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an automated CPR machine where the patient is placed on a firm backboard and the machine does the pumping for you. Now that we have a tool like that, we can increase the effectiveness of our CPR during transport and allow the rescuers to focus more on the rapid transport of the patient, even in suboptimal conditions like trying to provide CPR in the backseat of a 407. In the one instance that we've had in the past year to use the Autopulse, we found it also drastically reduced the stress on the team while improving the care given to the patient. And that was sort of an unforeseen side benefit of it, was just how much more comfortable everybody was knowing that the patient was receiving high quality care throughout the whole transport period and not being stressed about pauses during transport. So if you're involved in responding to these types of things, it might be something that you'll consider going forward. So finally, I'd just like to say a big thank you to all the agencies involved in this call. Alpine Helicopters provides our rescue helicopters and rescue pilots that are crucial for getting us into tricky situations and getting us back out of them. The STARS Air Ambulance came and met the patient in Lake Louise and brought them out to Calgary. Banff EMS and the Lake Louise Fire and Rescue teams met the helicopter and the patient in Lake Louise and managed the care of them and the transfer to STARS. And then finally, Parks Canada Dispatch, which is critical for all of our communication and sharing all, or orchestrating the handoff of the patient all the way through the chain of care back to Calgary. So a huge thanks to all of the people involved with that. So that's the description of kind of a pretty interesting day with some high pressure decision making and a pretty unique companion and self-rescue situation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thanks a lot, Conrad. Really, really profound rescue with our response with a lot to think about. And we already have a question here on the line, and I'll turn it over to Brent to manage those.
We have a question from the floor from Rupert Wedgwood.
Hi, Conrad. Thanks for the presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
I'm surprised we haven't chatted about this one before, but it sounds very much like a rescue specialist interview question for Parks Canada during an interview process.
It may become one.
I guess it's a three-part question. So just wondering if you think there is a role for RECO here, putting it on a subject who you think is deceased if you have to leave the scene quickly. Part 2 is there a use for InReach, do you think, as a means of communicating between responding helicopters that might be out of radio communication, teams in the helicopters coming in towards you to give them further details and to stand down, perhaps, or not? And lastly, does the ICS model of response help? Was that model adopted, and was it useful if it was?
Yeah, good questions. So in terms of the RECO, I think it would be a place for RECO if we did have to leave the patient. It's a high altitude place and would be a spot where if we had to leave somebody, they could end up there for a considerable amount of time beyond which their transceiver batteries would be useful. So a RECO chip placed on the patient could be really helpful. And I know we have a couple in our rescue room for that. And so yes. And then second question was about InReach helicopter to helicopter type of communication. In this particular case, we had good comms through the repeater system that we have, but it did make it difficult for the person on the first helicopter just because all the communication gets heard and doesn't really give them a chance to be quiet and just figure out what's on hand there. But in more remote places, and I know we've responded with you guys in Jasper to places outside of radio contact, I think InReach to InReach seems to be one of the better situations, and when paired with your phone can provide pretty quick communication where there is no radio or cell phone communication means. So yeah, I think it's an excellent type of scenario if it was more remote. And then the last question was about ICS, and I think we used the ICS structure fairly well on this. The second party coming in was the IC for the incident, and the first party on scene became the operations team, and it helped by having that second group coming in manage most of the communication with STARS, EMS, dispatch, fire and rescue, that type of thing. And we attempted to leave the first team open for just the access and recovery of that critical patient. So I think it did help. Had this gone on any longer, or as was happening on the Howes Peak incident, a more structured ICS response, or a more structured ICS setup would have been useful.
Thanks, Conrad. That's helpful. Just a point of consideration regarding the RECO for yourself and others listeners is if you're dealing with a deceased in an avalanche terrain, I would suggest turning off their beacon and just leaving the RECO on. I neglected to do this once on Robson, and the body's still out there.
All right, and our next question from the floor is from Chris Turner.
Hi, Conrad. Thanks very
Hi.
much for the presentation. Yeah, wonderful response in very challenging times. My question is, in your kind of debrief and discussion of it, was any thought mentioned about perhaps delaying the time when you switch over to from winter to spring hazard ratings?
Yeah, I don't know if we discussed it particularly relating to this accident, but it's certainly a constant topic of discussion, and I kind of feel like we would have probably gone further on that this year had the COVID not cut all our avalanche for public avalanche forecasting short. But yeah, the big question we deal with, I don't have a total answer for you, but the big question we deal with is when our upper elevations, especially kind of in the above 2,800 meters, are still generally in winter type snowpack, and the rest of the snowpack at lower elevations and on south-facing terrain is going into more of a melt freeze spring type condition. What are the criteria that we use to flip that switch? And right now it's generally sort of a consensus-based thing, but then when we get a big storm like this, we're not always quite sure what to do, and especially not totally sure how the public will interpret it or use it. So I don't have a totally good answer for you, but it's something we're certainly trying to figure out.
Thanks very much.
That's it for questions from the floor, Joe.
Great. Thank you for those great questions. And thanks, Conrad, for that really insightful presentation. Folks, we are a couple of minutes before the hour. We will come back at 1 minute past the hour to give you a few minutes to stretch, run to the bathroom, get a snack. I myself am test driving a new combination for me of apple and cheese. See you in a few minutes at 1 minute past.
Hey, Brent, you out there? It's Garth.
Hello, Garth. Yeah, I could hear you there.
Hey, man. Yeah, looks like I'm active. I see your screen.
Hey, Garth, just let me interrupt. We are live to the world, so I'm just going to bring you on in 1 minute.
You betcha.